Good evening. I'm Jeffrey Saks. I know some of you virtually from our work on the Web Yeshiva. I know some of you from my last visit when I was here. I was trying to remember when that was. About 2 years ago? It was the other shul. It was my first time here. Yeah. And it's great to be here in the new Lincoln Square Synagogue, which is really something very special. My work, my day job, involves the running of an organization called Atid, the major project of which is the Web Yeshiva. You have this information here about our programs. And because, as those of you who met me before or participate in my classes online know, I'm something of this Meshuga Agnon. So we also broadcast my courses, which are delivered from the Beit Agnon, Agnon's home in Yerushalayim, online. Some of you have participated in them. And you can go back and get the archives. There's now about 40, 50 hours worth of courses online at Web Yeshiva, archived, and you can go back and take a look at those if you're interested. If you are interested, you can jot down your email, and we'll let you know when the next online course is going to be beginning. Welcome to participate. So if you're interested, you can jot down your email, your name and your email. We will send you that information. How many of you are part of the ongoing Agnon group? Okay. How many of you are glad to be here but have never read any Agnon? Okay. And the rest of you are somewhere in the middle. Well, you know that there is here connected to a group of people with Lincoln Square. Right, that's why I didn't say it's a Lincoln Square, but it's a lot of people who are connected to Lincoln Square, and we're all friends. This ongoing group of this Agnon Chug. How many years has it been going on? Oh, that's pretty remarkable. So over the past 3 years, there was this meeting on Shabbatot where you finished Tmol Shel Shom, Agnon's magnum opus. So I guess my visit tonight is, I guess you're having like a siyum of sorts, not exactly the siyum Hashas, not even a siyum Masechta, but a worthwhile endeavor. This afternoon I spent the afternoon at the Met, which is, I know you people who live here, you never go, right? Like I haven't been to the Kotel in a while, I must guiltily confess, but Lahavdil, I'm saying, but in other words, you neglect the treasures that are right under your nose. But when you're a tourist for a week, you make it a point to get to the hotel, or if you're traveling the opposite direction, to make it to the Met. So you sit there in front of those water lilies, and you soak it in, and it's good for the soul. It's good for the soul, and reading Agnon is good for the soul. Our primary commitments, of course, are to Torah and mitzvot, and to Talmud Torah, properly defined, but reading Agnon, that's a different conversation. To what degree is reading Agnon, reading the novels of Agnon, a form of Torah study? And it surely is, but not properly defined. But it's good for the soul, and it, in these times where, sometimes as an observer of American Judaism from afar, sometimes it's more and more unrecognizable to me. So it's important to emphasize that it's important for a Jew to do good things that are good for his or her soul. And Agnon is certainly part of that. I was asked to give a kind of, let's say, intro to Agnon, and maybe this will encourage some people to join the group as well. An overview of Agnon's novels, with a particular emphasis on a kind of introduction to the new novel the group is about to start this coming Shabbat, tomorrow, day after tomorrow. So that's what I'm going to do. Agnon, and I presume he needs a word of intro. Agnon was born in 1887 or 1888. He always said he was born on Tisha B'Av 1888, August 8th, 1888. If you look at the calendar, Tisha B'Av that year didn't come out on August 8th. In fact, he was born in 1887, not on Tisha B'Av, in the summer, near Tisha B'Av. But this was part of the midrashicizing of his biography that he was involved in throughout his life. In fact, his name wasn't even Agnon. That was a pen name and later a Hebraized name that he took on, which was the fashion when people went on Aliyah in the beginning of the 20th century to Hebraize their names. He was born Shmuel Yosef Chachkis in the little town of Buchach, which was in the eastern part of Galicia, what today is the western Ukraine. It wasn't a shtetl. It was bigger than a shtetl, but it was far from being a city. It was a small town. When he lived there at the end of the 19th century, there were about 10,000 residents, about 7,500 of whom were Jewish. That's just recalling off of top of my memory. The exact statistics may differ by a percent or two. So it was a very Jewish home. He grew up in a very traditional Orthodox home. Like so many others, he is sent off to Cheder, to the Jewish schoolhouse. Yeah, that'd be great. As a child, he's quickly identified as an Ilui, as a boy wonder genius. And the Rebbe tells his father, I have nothing much to teach him. So he learns one-on-one with his father. In this regard, there's this interesting parallel to the exact biography of Rabbi Soloveitchik, who had the same experience, short time in Cheder, then he learns one-on-one with his father. His father was a Rav, a Talmid Chacham, but he did not work as a rabbi. He worked in the fur trade. He worked as a merchant. And in the mornings when the father, Shalom Mordechai, would be plying his trade, young Shmuel Yosef was sent off to the Beit Midrash, which was a kind of Beit Midrash / very well stocked library, Jewish library, for a small town this size. And he would sit and he would read, and he had one of those kinds of memories where he just absorbed everything, remembered everything, so much so that years later, when he spends these years of sojourn in Berlin, the first time he meets Gershom Shalom, who was about 10 years younger. Shalom was working as the librarian in the Jewish library in Berlin. He sees Agnon going through the card catalog. And at that point, Agnon was already a somewhat well-known figure. He'd already published. He was this Hebrew author that was visiting from Israel. He was an Austjud. He wasn't a Yeke. He was a Polisher Yid, a Galician. Who was there, which was something exotic to these Jews who were, in that period in Germany, there was this kind of renaissance of, not of ritual observance, but of Jewish life and Jewish learning. You had figures like Buber and Rosenzweig and others. Even Kafka himself is sucked into this at one point. And Agnon is there going through the card catalog, and Shalom goes up to him, this kind of quasi-celebrity, says, "Can I help you?" And Agnon says, "I'm looking for a book." You're all old enough to remember what card catalogs are, right? So I was telling this story to a group of like seniors in high school, and I had explained to them what it was. She says, "I'm looking for a book." "What book?" "One I haven't read yet." Agnon did not suffer from excess modesty. He knew his greatness. Around the age of 20, he makes Aliyah. He goes to Yafo in the first decade of the 20th century as part of the second Aliyah, which you read about in Tmol Shel Shom. In this novel, Tmol Shel Shom, the main character, this Yitzchak Kumar, is in no way a projection of Agnon. Agnon very often crafted characters that were autobiographical projections of himself into the story. Yitzchak Kumar is not one of them. The character Chemdat, who you encountered, and then you read this other story, Givat HaChol, the character Chemdat is the closest autobiographical projection of Agnon himself. Yitzchak Kumar is not that projection, but all of the biographical details match up. The dates all match up. The story of a young man going off an Aliyah from Buchach, he leaves the town the same time Agnon left. He travels along the same route that Agnon traveled. He lives first in Yafo and then moves to Yerushalayim the same way that Agnon did. His life is completely different. It takes a completely different turn. But all of those biographical milestones that take place up to being bit by a rabid dog, of course. So they all map onto the chronology of Agnon's voyage to Palestine, to Uz. He arrives in Yaffo. Interestingly, at that point, he's removed his yarmulke, and he adopts a life of a secular Jew, which was not at all uncommon amongst young men in the second Aliyah at that stage. Despite that fact, he becomes incredibly close and becomes a great, adoring fan of the great Rav Kook, Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Kook, who later becomes the chief rabbi of all of Palestine. At that point is the chief rabbi of Yaffo. And he becomes very close to Rav Kook, who took a great interest in this young man's writings, because Rav Kook thought that part of the return to the national return of the Jewish people to their land also would involve a return to a Jewish creativity, the arts, poetry, the sciences, that it would be a more authentic Jewish creativity instead of a kind of imitating, styles of the West in a kind of Jewishy way. And he identified Agnon's writings as, the hallmark of this. I'll cut the biography short. He goes in 1912 for what's meant to be a period, an extended period of time in Germany, but World War I breaks out. He gets stuck in Europe, incidentally. The same thing happened to Rav Kook. And he got married, and he had 2 kids, and perhaps you've heard of people that want to go on Aliyah, and they're on the 5-year plan. I'm not trying to make anyone feel guilty. But I have a friend. I've been living in Israel 20 years. When I went on Aliyah, he was also coming on Aliyah. But he was on the 5-year plan. Every time I see him, he's still on the 5-year plan. He just keeps hitting the reset button. So he got delayed. 1924, his house burns down in Germany. With it, his library of many of thousands of volumes, the manuscripts to at least 2 nearly completed works. He didn't do remote backup. It all goes up in flames, and he says, that's it, this is a sign, we're being punished. Returning to Yerushalayim, he returns to Yerushalayim. At a certain point, he moves out to the Talpiot neighborhood, which was really then just a suburb of Jerusalem. 1931, he moves into the house that is now known as the Beit Agnon. 1966, they gave him the Nobel Prize. Lots of things happened in between. He had this very long writing career. The comparison to Kafka that I mentioned earlier, or before we started rather, to those that were sitting here, Agnon was very often compared to Kafka. It was a comparison that he strongly objected to, even going so far as to make the outlandish claim he'd never heard of Kafka, never read him, wouldn't know where to find him on the bookshelf. Somebody visits the Beit Agnon, they see there's in the library like a well-worn copy of Kafka. Somebody says to him, I thought you never read him. He looks at it, he says, must be my wife's. But what he meant was that the comparison between his writings and Kafka's writings, even though they bear certain similarities, don't confuse similarities with influence. And they may have come from someplace else. Last night at a talk I gave uptown at YU, and in this course that I recently gave online, I discussed the influence of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov on both of them. And the influence of Rabbi Nachman on Agnon would have rendered much of Agnon's writings no less Kafkaesque, what we call Kafkaesque. But even Kafka didn't invent the Kafkaesque, didn't invent the surreal. He just perfected it, and we call it on his name. But it's not that this genre didn't exist beforehand. When he was in Germany, Agnon meets Shlomo Zalman Shokin, who was a very wealthy, self-made German Jew. He owned a chain of department stores, which he very cleverly liquidated and got his assets out of Germany in time. He comes to Yerushalayim. Until this day, the Shokin Publishing House is the publishers of, that's the Shokin Publishing House, the publishers of Agnon. He buys the Haaretz newspaper, which becomes and Agnon becomes the kind of house author for the newspaper. Newspapers, they're always crying about how nobody buys the newspaper anymore. Newspaper industry is in collapse. Why don't they get an Agnon and hire him to?
They don't grow trees.
That's the problem. And Agnon, from the time he's a young man, a young middle-aged man, has a stipend and is able to support himself as an author. Kafka worked in an insurance agent. Do any of you work in insurance? No? None of you? Okay, so then I can say it. Can you imagine like anything more like, that's going to suck the creative juices out of an artist than being, and he was a clerk. Kafka was a clerk. Yes, no, he wasn't the only one. No, most of the great authors, right, suffered. Einstein had to work as a clerk in the patent office and do theory of relativity, like while the midnight oil was burning. Yeah, there's no shortage of examples. Agnon is the counterexample. He gets this stipend from Shokin. We don't know the exact financial details. It was enough to keep him comfortable, but not complacent. And he had to produce. And in exchange, Shokin got the copyrights on all of Agnon's works until today, and they guard it quite zealously. But because of that, he was able to have this really long writing career, as opposed to Kafka, who was dead by the time he was 40 of the tuberculosis. Agnon lived to be 82, and up until the very last year when he suffers a stroke, he was writing. He had this extremely long writing career. He left behind manuscripts which he instructed his daughter what to do with them after he died, and more books were published after he died than he put out in his own lifetime. So he had this extremely long writing career. He wrote in many different genres, in many different styles, from the very, very, very short story, the novella, which may have been the form that he perfected most, was the best form. Some of his greatest works are in that form. In this series that I'm now editing of these new revised translations and new translations in English, the next volume hopefully will be a collection of 4 novellas, headlined by a new translation of Shnei Talmidei Chachamim Shayu B'Yireinu, one of his really great works. And so keep your eyes open for that. And the translator of one of the translators of... Who is this next to you? This is your husband. One of the translators of the work is here with us, and we've been working together virtually for a long time on it, and I'm pleased to see Rana Rogel here in person for the first time, just instead of her little picture on the screen. But the novels presented a particular problem. From very early on, he wanted to be a novelist. Right? Like we have the conception of the great American novel. Right? So the great Hebrew novel, that was the mark he set for himself. And he in fact published in his lifetime 4 big novels, and one even bigger novel was published posthumously. Is Ziva Shapiro?
Yeah.
Oh, well, and here's Ziva Shapiro, another person I've been working with virtually all this time. Nice to meet you in person. We'll talk about you in a second. And the novels are problematic. They're problematic as a form. There's a very important essay by Dan Miron, who's here in New York, who teaches at Columbia. It's a Hebrew essay, but it's available in English. If anybody likes it, you can email me. My email's on the sheet. I'm happy to send it to you. The essay in English is called Domesticating a Foreign Genre, Agnon's Transactions with the Novel. And it's, besides the fact that it contains a very good summary of all of his novels, it describes the problem that he had with the novel as a form. That the novel itself, the whole idea of a novel, is a very European genre. No Jew had ever written a novel. Jews had written sipurim. Right? They'd even perfected the sipur as a kind of literary, didactic, religious genre in the world of Hasidic stories. Both the kind of Hasidic stories, we all recognize as Hasidic stories. Little boy goes into shul, he doesn't know how to daven, so he blows a whistle, and the crowd gets upset, and the Baal Shem Tov says, no, don't you know, his tefillah is better than yours, because he's really sincere and you're all fakers. Is there anybody who hadn't heard that story before? Right? Kind of like a classic, famous Hasidic tale. which exists in many different iterations in different genres. There's some that didn't like the idea that the story is that there's like an antinomian element. The story takes place either on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, the playing of the flute or the whistle on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and then that being validated by Baal Shem Tov was considered problematic by some. So there's, like a different Gilgul of the story where he whistles. There's another one where he doesn't know how to daven. All he knows is the Aleph Bet. So he says Aleph Bet Gimel Dalet Hey Vav Zayin, Aleph Bet Gimel Dalet Hey Vav, etc., etc. And they're starting to annoy the people around him. And he's, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he knows the tefillot. So he'll just take all the letters and he'll combine them up however it is. But this is a Hasidic tale that we all know. Or the Hasidic tales of Rabbi Nachman, which are extremely different than the kind of classical Hasidic tale, because they're not Jewish. Meaning they're not explicitly Jewish. The form that Rabbi Nachman used was much closer to Grimm and to the romantic German or European folk tales of a king and a princess and a giant and the whole realm of magical realism, the surreal, right? The dream. So you see the influence on Agnon through that magical realism. If you know the stories of the Sefer HaMa'asim, this collection of short stories of Agnon's that are highly surreal. But Agnon sets off to write the novel. His first novel, here's the collection of the collected works now. His first novel is called Hachnasat Kala. In English, it's translated as The Bridal Canopy. It's a very problematic translation. The translation was already done in the 1930s. The book first came out in 1931. The plot is set in the 1820s. It's even hard to call it a novel. Because what it is it's a frame story. And in this, he was probably influenced by Cervantes, by Don Quixote. It's the story of Rabbi Yudel Chassid. If you've read Smol Shel Shom, then you've heard about Rabbi Yudel Chassid. Rabbi Yudel Chassid, this poor pauper, righteous man, but a poor pauper with 3 indigent daughters, living in a hovel. The eldest is coming of age. He needs to raise a dowry. So the Rebbe sends him off to go a schnorring in the town with his wagon driver, Reb Nota. Right? It's Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. And as they go along, and Professor Avram Holtz has this very important annotated edition. It's the only properly annotated edition of an Agnon work. He has this map that was actually prepared by his wife, by Dr. Toby Holtz, who teaches here at Barnard. This map on the end piece tracking the cities that this Reb Yudel travels, and the different tales that happen to him along the way. So, to a certain degree, it's not even properly considered a novel. The translation, it was translated already in the 30s. Interestingly, it was the Book of the Month Club selection, which I think must mean, I think it must mean that Shokin paid off the Book of the Month Club in order to do it. And there was this, I don't know who prepared it, whether it was the translator or it was the publisher, but could you imagine being this Iowa housewife, who's never met a Jew in her life, and she gets this novel about Rabbi Yudel Chassid, this holy, righteous man in Galicia, in Poland, in the 1820s, and the translation itself, the translator aimed for a kind of antiquated air. Meaning even in the 1930s when it was translated, it sounded antiquated. Now, 80 years later, even more so. It's a very problematic translation. It's also problematic for a different reason, because after it came out in Hebrew and it was translated into English, Agnon then expanded the novel by almost 30%, which you can understand is easy to do in a book that has all these different, freestanding stories held together by this frame. It's like an accordion, you just stretch it. And it was never retranslated, so the English edition is missing about a third of what we now have as the Hebrew edition.
The English edition was a 1931 publication?
It was, in other words, the Hebrew book came out in 1931. The English translation was done in the 30s.
That edition.
And then Agnon subsequently expanded the work. So it's a problematic translation. It wouldn't be sufficient to revise it. It needs to be translated from scratch. The next novel, which is the first proper novel is Sipur Pashut, a simple story, which was just issued last week in Yerushalayim. I'm pretty sure this is the only copy in North America yet, but you should be able to get it soon, in a revised translation. It's the tale of, this is a classic, Hillel Halkin translated it in the 80s, and I worked with him to revise the translation. There were inevitable typos, and every time it was reprinted, the typos, it was just an offset. It just because it's the first time it's been reset. So the typos, po v'sham, every translator reconsiders choices that they make. So it was an opportunity to revisit that, fix the odd error here and there that were there, inconsistencies in translation and things like that. And then I wrote a new preface, and we added a bibliography of kind of annotated bibliography of everything that's been written on the work in English, on the assumption that somebody who's reading in English is not going to also then go off and read the literary criticism in Hebrew, but wants to know what's been written on in English. So to make that available, I'm particularly proud because I took the cover photo. It was completely interesting story. I went up to Halkin lives in Zichron Yaakov. So I went up to Zichron Yaakov to have this working session with him. And I'm walking around Zichron. Zichron's very beautiful, but I never get up there. And I'm walking around. There's this old door. If you want, I'll pass it around. And I took a picture of the door, and then when we were looking for a cover image, it struck me, that central image of Al Kapot Hamanul, at the handles of the lock, that image that's taken from Shir HaShirim as the kind of metaphor for, the blocked love. The lover and her beloved, they're on opposite sides of the door, but you're not going to get out of bed, you're not going to dirty your feet. There's something in the opportunity for love and for happiness and for reunion, or if you take it on the level of the nimshal, the meaning, the allegorical meaning of the unity or the division between God and the Jewish people being divided at the handles of the lock, in the phrase of Chazal. So that was the association, and that's the central theme of the book. The book tells the story of pass it around if you want, of young Herschel Horowitz, who's the son of middle-class Balabatish merchants in a little town called Shibush. Shibush is Buchach. It's the literary doppelganger of Buchach. Shibush means mixed up, muddled, mistaken. One of our Web Yeshiva students in Poland, we have quite a few Web Yeshiva students in Poland, and there's something, poignant about sitting in Yerushalayim teaching Agnon stories about Poland back to Jews in Poland today, told me that in Polish, a shibushel is, in Polish Yiddish. Anybody here speak Polish Yiddish?
Significant coin.
And it's a gornish, nothing, a postage stamp, right? So that meaning presumably would not have been lost on Agnon. So any chance that he had, if Agnon could choose a word that carried two meanings, or a word that carried three meanings, he would always choose the word that could contain more multiple variant meanings. And that way he really was this great midrashic writer. So presuming that meaning would not have been lost on the idea of Buchach, his town, being Shibush, this kind of muddled mirror of the town that he grew up in, but it also meaning like podunk, like this little no place, this little spot on a map that you would have overlooked. What does Tevye say about Anatevka? Tevye has a line like that about Anatevka. Like, you wouldn't even notice you were there unless you're, except for the fact your boots would have gotten muddied walking through its streets. It's a little nothing. It's a little one-horse town. Young Herschel falls in love with the maidservant Blume Nacht, night flower, but of course his overbearing Jewish mother, Cyril, who's very class-conscious, is not going to allow him to marry the maidservant. And he's married off to Mina, to a more appropriate match, the daughter of nouveau riche merchants like they are. And this drives him to madness. Agnon is typically cagey, at least telegraphing four possible reasons for why he goes mad. Perhaps there's a curse in the family, perhaps it's the influence of the overbearing mother. You would not be mistaken to read Freud between the lines here. Perhaps it's the heartbreak That's, we're presumed to assume on the first read. Perhaps he's not crazy at all. Perhaps the whole thing's an act to get out of the army. And that multiple reading and that's what I write about in the preface. I first encountered this book in college while suffering a terrible heartbreak. Perhaps you've heard such things happen. And completely by coincidence, I picked up this book not knowing what it was about, and about this young man who goes through heartbreak and is driven to madness, and then how he comes out of it, and how he returns to some semblance of what it is, what would be to live, back to become like his parents, normal balabatish middle class people. And if it's an arranged marriage that's not one of great passion and romance, well, like Tevye says, do you love me? Do I what? Well, what is love? Right? 25 years, Well, then I guess I love you too, right? So that's a simple story. The next novel, Oreach Natal Alun. Oreach Natal Alun, I'm going to talk about at greater length because that's the introduction that you all need for your project of starting to read it. A Guest for the Night, translated in a decent translation as A Guest for the Night, is written in 1939. It's set in 1930. And here we really do have a very clear autobiographical projection of Agnon, the man, through Agnon, the writer, or I should say Chachkis, the man, through his sock puppet, Agnon, the writer, right? That's a term people talk about now, right? Sock puppetry. Into the narrator of the story. Although you should always be careful never to confuse, this is true in all literature, the narrator and the author. Sometimes the author is projecting his own point of view through his narrator, and sometimes quite the contrary. That's what's called in literature an unreliable narrator, where we can't even believe what the narrator is telling us. Our gut instinct is to assume that whatever the narrator is telling us is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but. But it's not always the case. Sometimes the narrator is kind of misleading us or not telling us all the facts in order to create some kind of tension. And then there's a surprise at the end of the novel. Can you think of another example of maybe the most well-known example, at least in English literature, of an unreliable narrator?
A Good Soldier.
What?
A Good Soldier by...
A Good Soldier, yeah, I never...
By Ford Maddox Ford.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I was thinking of Catcher in the Rye. You remember high school? So you remember Catcher in the Rye, right? Holden Caulfield is narrating the novel about the story that happens to us, and only at the end do you discover that he's narrating it to us from within a mental institution. Had Holden, the narrator, given that fact away in the opening sentence, here I am sitting in my... What? What?
I was just going to read that book.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, it's worth reading in all cases. Look, I don't feel guilty. The book's been around for 60 years. You've had a good long chance to read it. The fact I spoiled it now, it's not like it's still playing in the theaters. Had the narrator told you in the opening paragraph, I'm sitting now in a padded cell, let me tell you how I got here, it would be a completely different novel altogether. I'll come back to Oreach Natal Alun. The fourth important novel, Tzmol Shel Shom, which you've just finished. Tzmol Shel Shom is Agnon's magnum opus. And kol hakavod to you for undertaking it. I would have never started with Tzmol Shel Shom. But since you did it, fabulous. Agnon once famously said, any book not worth reading twice probably wasn't worth reading the first time. So, having read Tzmol Shel Shom, now you have to reread it. And it really is the case of the second reading and the third reading. And that's what I write in this preface to this new Sipur Pashut. I encounter it as a 20-year-old experiencing the heartbreak, and I identify with elements of the plot. And then you know what? You read it 10 years later when you're 30 and you're happily married and you have a kid or two. You see different things. You go back, you read it when you're 40, you see different things. There are certain books that There's certain books that everybody should read once every 10 years. And Shmol Shel Shom is one of them. And the fact that some of you haven't read it yet, so get going. Put it on your list above Catcher in the Rye. There is a translation of Shmol Shel Shom called Only Yesterday, translated by Barbara Harshav. There were some problems with the it was considered to be a problematic translation. I'll leave it. I'll leave it at that. But it's certainly an understandable translation. Somebody who cannot read the Hebrew, will still understand the story. It's not like she left out Balak the dog. What's interesting about Shmol Shel Shom is that it's really two different stories. And Agnon set out to write it as two different stories. It had a lot of starts and stops, and there were earlier chapters that were written and put aside. Agnon was an inveterate reviser of his works. He would polish it every time they'd be republished. He would revise it again. He would write things and put it in the drawer and let it percolate, and then come back to it.
It's like a paraphrase of if it's not worth reading more than once, it's not worth writing.
It's not worth writing more than once. Anything worth writing is worth writing again and again and again. He really was a perfectionist, and that's why some of those stories that were published posthumously had been written decades earlier. And he wrote them and he put them in the drawer, and he, for whatever reason, didn't get back to it, or he wasn't satisfied with it, or he was only willing to let it out, and it's kind of, everybody understands that posthumous work may not have had the final imprimatur of the author. He wasn't prepared to publish in his lifetime. He let his daughter publish it. Shmol Shel Shom was initially two different stories. One is this very realistic novel of a young man going off on the second Aliyah, like I said, very much the chronology of Agnon's own life, this Yitzchak Kumer, who happens to be the Ben Beno Shel Bat Bito, the great-great-grandson of Reb Yudel Chassid. He even has a little brother left back at home in Buchach, in Shibush, named Yudel, who I guess we would presume is named after his Elta Zedi, Reb Yudel Chassid. Reb Yudel Chassid lived in a world, the novel set in the 1820s, lives in a world of faith and miracles. And in fact, without giving away the end of Hachnasat Kala, Rabbi Yudel Chassid, despite all of his touring around the schnorring, is saved at the end of the day through a miracle that's almost Deus ex machina, right? At the end, the last minute, case of double identity, of mistaken identity. He's confused for being a rich person, and sometimes, being confused for a rich person helps you get rich, right? Perhaps people that have done an IPO, right? That being confused with somebody who's rich then leads one thing to another, and in a very comic way, they're saved at the end of the day. It's not Deus ex machina, but it's chicken ex machina. His faithful, trusty rooster, they're all starving to death. They've got no food. They've got one scrawny rooster. So shech the rooster and make a soup. No. This rooster, whose name is Rebbe Zarach, you don't catch the pun, so ask someone. This Rebbe Zarach, we have to save him. We can't eat him, because he's the rooster. He's the alarm clock. He's the one that goes cock-a-doodle-doo at Zrichat HaChama, so that Rebbe Yudel can wake up and go daven shachris. You're not going to shecht your alarm clock that helps you get to shul in the morning. Yitzchak Kumer, his great-great-grandson, 100 years later, goes off on Aliyah, and like so many people in the second Aliyah, and that wave of Aliyah leading up to World War II, he no longer lives in a world which is bounded by faith and by tradition. He lives in a world where those borders are much more permeable. And miracles don't happen to him. And that line is repeated again and again throughout the novel. That in our days, we don't have miracles like those that happened to great-great-grandfather Rabbi Yudel Chassid. And it's kind of left with this typical openness, this indeterminate question. Is it that miracles no longer happen to us, we who already live on the other side of what what we now recognize as this breach. We who live in the beginnings of the modern period instead of the end of the world of tradition. Is it that miracles don't happen for us because we don't believe in them? Or do we not believe in them because they don't happen for us? And he's not chad mashmei. He doesn't come down and tell you. Typically, he leaves this question open. And people will therefore read the work in different ways. People who approach Agnon from the perspective of faith and tradition often find it to be a very profound endorsement of the value of faith and tradition, although you're constantly aware that he's satirizing and he's skewering and he's poking, and he's people that approach Agnon from the perspective of a more critical, of a more what I'll call modern perspective, often see him as the great critic of religion. Amos Oz famously wrote this rather problematic book. I mean, it was problematic. It was roundly criticized. Oz, of course, is a novelist, but he wrote a work of literary criticism. It was translated into English as Silence of the Heavens. It's an analysis of Agnon's treatment of religion. And the lengthiest chapter there, about half the book, is dedicated to an analysis of Tmol Shel Shom. So we have this. It's available in English also. In Hebrew, it's called Shtikat HaShamayim. That's Tmol Shel Shom. That's Tmol Shel Shom. No, that's only half of Tmol Shel Shom. That's the realistic half of Tmol Shel Shom. The surrealistic half...
What did he say?
It's a longer conversation. The surrealistic element of Tmol Shel Shom, which starts off as a different book, is the story of the Kelev Balak, a Jerusalem stray dog, who's not, it's not the kind of book where humans and animals can interact, where they can speak to each other. But we, the reader, are privy to the thoughts of this sentient dog. And he's a very Jewish dog, right? He's thinking about Cheshbon HaNefesh, and Tzaddik V'Ralo, and why the righteous suffer, and reward and punishment, and without giving away too much, these two characters, Yitzchak Kumar and the dog, their lives become intertwined. And a full third of the book is given over to telling the story of Jerusalem and what's going on through the perspective of this dog Balak. Balak is dog spelled backwards, is Kelev spelled backwards, except for the fact that it's not. And that's part of the humor of how he gets this name, because Kuf and Kaf. When the translation was reviewed in the New York Times book review, the review, I forget who reviewed it, the reviewer very cleverly, the headline, whether it was the reviewer or was the editors, put as the headline, "Dog spelled backwards." In other words, dog spelled backwards is God, and the presence of God, and the presence of punishment, and these are all issues that are in there. So the fact, Agnon would have enjoyed the fact that the wordplay works also in English. The end of the day, the dog bites Yitzchak Kumar dies of rabies, so I've given it away, but there's more to it than that. That's Tmol Shel Shom. It's the great tale of the second Aliyah. Agnon's fifth novel, his posthumous novel, the novel that gave him the most trouble, was Shira, which we also just put out in revised translation, and the translator, Ziva Shapira, is here. So also nice to meet you. It was initially translated in the 90s.
It doesn't feel like that long ago.
Right. So originally translated in the 90s, and it was republished here and there. And now we've in this series that we're putting out with the Toby Press, we translated it. We republished it with a few revisions to the translation. And a few other ancillary things as well. There was, in the initial volume, in the original edition, an afterword by Robert Alter. And Alter did something interesting. He analyzed the story partially through looking at the paintings. There are very many, one of the motifs in the work is the presence of different famous painting reproductions of Rembrandts and others. And and he wrote this essay. It was a very clever way of looking at exploring one motif in the novel. The original publisher didn't think of including reproductions of those paintings. So in this edition, we added that, and I think it's a very useful to the.
Alters thing in there too.
So we have we republished Alters afterward, but we added in these reproductions of these illustrations, which I think is a handy thing to do. Shira is a novel that Agnon worked on for many decades. Early chapters were published starting already in the 40s. That was, by the way, many of the novels, including Tamil Shel Shom. Chapters would be published in the newspaper, in literary journals, and you understood that you were just getting a taste of what was to come. It's the story of Manfred Herbst, a German academic who's come to Yerushalayim. It takes place in the 1930s. The novel is spread out over a number of years. He's a German academic, German Jewish academic, studying Byzantine tomb inscriptions. Agnon loved to satirize the academics, particularly the Hebrew University. You must have seen this film that came out the year before last, Footnote Herat Shulayim. There is a significant element of Shira in Herat Shulayim. As a matter of fact, in the next edition, it's coming out in the next few days, of the Jewish Review of Books, I translated a chapter from the archives, not a chapter that's included as part of the main novel. Agnon left all types of things on the cutting room floor. There's a satirical sketch of academic politics. Anybody who's spent any amount of time in a university, either as a graduate student or if you have had an academic career, you will recognize this. And this character, this Bachlam, this Professor Bachlam, who was understood to be a satire on Professor Yosef Klausner, who was Agnon's neighbor, Amos Oz's great uncle. Oz in his Tale of Love and Darkness. That Natalie Portman right now is filming a Tale of Love and Darkness in Yerushalayim, and I really wanted to get in touch with her and. Who doesn't want to get in touch with Natalie Portman? but I'm sorry, I'm blushing. I want to get in touch with her and have her come to the Beit Agnon, which is this, which is a pivotal location in the novel, and maybe she'll be looking for an extra to play Agnon, and I did the job, but to the best of my knowledge, they have not contacted the Beit Agnon, so maybe they're cutting that part out. I don't know. So Klausner was Agnon's neighbor, and they had this famously chilly relationship, so Agnon really skewers him in this character, this Professor Bachlam. So in this chapter, which will be appearing as an excerpt in the next Jewish Review of Books, I assume it'll be online this week, next week. There's this very sharp satire of the academic politics, but that's all the kind of semi-comic or tragicomic side plot. This university professor toiling away, trying to get tenure, trying to finish his great masterpiece of research, Agnon describes him as like a shepherd tending his flock of index cards, and he's got all the index cards. He's quite literally the academic who cannot see the forest for the trees. He's got all these index cards. He can't put it together. He can't finish this great work, which will hopefully grant him tenure and let him advance in the university. And he's being held down. And his very name is Herbst, which in German means autumn, fall. Like so many seasons, days falling away, like so many dry leaves. Literally a man in the autumn, moving, through middle age, passing by, loaded down by departmental politics and domestic obligations and children and all these other things that are keeping him from accomplishing what he needs to accomplish. But that's all the side plot. The main plot is an extramarital affair that he initiates on the very night that his wife is in hospital giving birth with the eponymous nurse Shira, and how this love affair becomes this obsession which is partially responsible for derailing him from all of the things that he should be focusing on in life. But midway through the novel, Shira disappears. And his search for her is also part of what eats away at him. And it's not clear what happens to her. And the novel was left unfinished. And after he had published a number of chapters, he put it aside, came back to other things, and he never got it going. At the very end of his life, he enlisted the work of his daughter, Emunah Yaron, who became his literary executor. She's still alive. Can I know her? She's 93. She still comes around to the Beit Agnon. She's not quite as spry as she once was, and she was responsible for putting out all the books. On Agnon's first yard site, they published Shira. But it does not have a definitive ending. And in fact, both in the Hebrew as well as in the English translation, there's the ending and there's an alternative ending. The alternative ending, which seems to be the one that Agnon put aside, is the one that most people who've read the novel, they assume that is the ending. When the novel was staged as a play, that's the ending that they put in. And what happens is that Shira had contracted leprosy. There are hints of that earlier in the novel. And she was in the leper colony, in Yerushalayim. There is to this day a leper colony which has just become an artist's colony. There was this old, where the Shalom Hartman Institute is in Yerushalayim. Right across the street was the famous leper colony of Jerusalem. And she was in the leper colony, and Herbst sacrifices himself in order to be reunited with her, because once you go into the leper colony, you don't come out. And that's the alternative ending to the novel, which most people mistakenly recall as the ending to the novel. But it was an unfinished work. There were all types of things that posed trouble to him, and many people, including Agnon's own daughter, speculate that the very un-Agnonic, writing a long novel around the plot device of an extramarital affair was very much off of his map, off of his comfort zone, and that may have been part of what gave him trouble. That's speculation, of course. Let's go back to Oreach Natalalun, which is really what we need to accomplish tonight. Oreach Natalalun, a guest for the night. If you have these sheets, where are these sheets? Here. Oreach Natalalun. Well, we'll skip some of this. There's an important work called Ir Umlo'ah. It was also a posthumous collection. It's Agnon's fattest book. It's a collection of about 150 stories, all about Agnon's hometown of Buchach. And it was written throughout the 50s and 60s. And it's a kind of imaginative history. It's the stories, some of which are historical and some of which are highly fantastic and literary creations, but it's the history of his town, of Buchach, and it's written from the perspective, almost 400 years of history of this little town of Buchach, and it's written, very much with the agenda of memorializing the town, which was completely destroyed in the Holocaust. He says, this is the quote at the tippy top, "Ma kan emet u ma kan dimyon." What's truth? Truth with a capital T, and what's imagination? Hazman asa et hadimyon emet, v'ha'emet dimyon. Over time, truth becomes imagination, and imagination becomes truth. And this was part of his debate with the academic world. Over there in the Hebrew University is the Department of Historians. You think you know what history is? With your footnotes, I'll tell you what history is. Who's to say that a literary history, that an imaginative history, while not were we to travel back in time, we may not have actually found that there was this character, Fischl Karp. Right? If you remember the story, Mazal Dagim, Pisces, one of the great comic highlights of the work. But that doesn't mean that it's not true. Something doesn't have to have had happened in order for it to be true. And that was his agenda. And then there's this wonderful evocative quote at the beginning of the Irum Loa. He gives this kind of tour, this grand tour of the town. Here's the old Beit Midrash, and here's the new Beit Midrash, and here's the Beit Knesset, Beit Knesset Hagadol, and here are the Batei Midrash. And we have all these very nice pictures of Buchach and what it looked like, and afterwards you can come up and take a look at them. And at each stop along the way, here's the well, and here's the shuk, and here's the marketplace, and he tells a story of something connected to the physical components of the town. In the Beit Knesset, there's a menorah, and there's a shulchan, and there's an aron, and there's a lamp, and there's a story behind each and every one. But now that the Nazis and their willing accomplices have come and destroyed everything, all of that's been destroyed. The physical culture of the town no longer exists. Ma nishtayer mikol hakelim hamifurim shayu beveit hakneset hagadol? What remains of that synagogue that once was? Sipurei ma'asiot nishtayeru. Only the telling of the tales. When all of those Jews and those children and those people have been wiped out and destroyed, all that remains is the stories, and that's the power of the storytelling. Oreach natal alun. If you look towards the bottom, there's this pasuk from Yirmiyahu. Mikvei Yisrael Moshio be'et Sarah lama tiyeh kager be'eretz u'ka'oreach natal alun. Yirmiyahu, who's aware that there's a destruction coming, that Jewish life and civilization is going to be wiped out, going to be completely transformed. He's saying to God, the Moshiach, the Redeemer of the Jewish people, don't be a stranger. Don't go away. Don't be merely ke'oreach natal alun, like somebody who just is a passerby, somebody just passing through. The translator chooses the title, A Guest for the Night. Not a literal translation, but an accurate one. So the title of The Guest for the Night has this echo of the separation, not the great divorce, the separation between God and the Jewish people. Oreach natal alun, you'll read it now, and besides the fact that I'm going to ruin one element of it for you, if you were to read it now, and we were to meet again in a year to talk about it, you would swear that it was written maybe in the 1950s, but set in the early 1930s as a kind of narrative prophecy of the destruction that was about to befall European Jewry. But in fact, the book was published at the beginning of September 1939. There were other things going on in the world on September 1st, 1939. As a matter of fact, if you get a copy of the newspaper, of the Haaretz newspaper from, it must have been September 2nd. In other words, Germany invades Poland on September 1st, which means, the newspaper is always a day behind. The headlines: Plishat Germania LePolin. Germany invades Poland. At the bottom left-hand corner, there's an advertisement announcing the publication of a new book by Agnon called Oreach natal alun. It's based on a kernel of autobiography. In 1930, the first collected writings of Agnon were going to be published by Shokin. Then it was 4 volumes. Believe it or not, in 1930, the printing industry was not sophisticated enough in Israel to publish 4 Hebrew volumes according to the standards that both Shokin and Agnon wanted. So it's published in Germany, in Leipzig, was the center of Hebrew publishing in Europe. It's 1930. It's not it's just around the corner. But the center of Hebrew publishing is still in Germany. Agnon goes for the summer back to Leipzig to supervise the project while the typesetters are setting the type, which was another thing I had to explain to these teenagers. They had no idea what I was talking about. While the typesetters are setting the type in the printing house, Agnon's revising. So they call up Shokin and they say, you got to get rid of this guy. So they physically removed him. He was not allowed on the premises because the project would never get done. And the books are published, and on his way back home, he makes a detour through Galicia. At that point, his parents had both passed on. His siblings had all left. Agnon was the eldest of 5 siblings. All of his siblings had gotten out of Europe before the war. Some went to Israel. Some came here to America. He had maybe an uncle or two. He had not really ever been back to Buchach. It's like this fascinating case. He left Buchach before he was 20 years old. But he never left. In other words, you can take the boy out of Buchach, but you can't take the Buchach out of the boy. And he continues writing it and occupying it and living it throughout the rest of his life. He made one very brief visit when he was living in Germany when his father was dying. He goes to see his father who's dying. He goes for a few days. He goes back to Germany, gets a telegram, you better turn around. He turns around. By the time he gets there, his father has died and been buried, and he sits the rest of Shiva with whatever relatives were still there. And that was the only other time he'd been back to Buchach, just for a couple of days. And this week-long visit that he makes to Galicia, a few days of which he spends in Buchach. And he turns this kernel of an autobiographical fact into a whole novel. And the novel is about a guest, a native of Shibush. After the Holocaust, all the stories written after the Holocaust, he stopped using the name Shibush because he wanted to, he could only be so flippant about the town after it was destroyed. About a native of Shibush who had gone off in Aliyah in the first decade of the 20th century, and now in 1930 comes back for a visit. But in the novel, it's not a week-long visit; it's a year-long visit. And the novel takes place over the course. He arrives on Erev Yom Kippur, and it takes place over the course of the year. It's in 80 short chapters. It's actually quite good for a book club if you're going to be meeting every week. It'll take you 80 weeks, right? Because it's not so long. And it was initially serialized in the newspaper. That's why Dickens also had these kind of short episodic chapters, because it was initially serialized chapter in the newspaper from fall of 1938 to the spring of 1939, and then it's published in book form in September 1939. But it is a dark prophecy of the destruction that's about to come, which is why if you read it, you're certain that it's written after the Holocaust. What would you say? A retro? What? It's quite depressing. Well, have you read it? So it is depressing, but it ends on an optimistic note. And in this, it's quite unusual for Agnon, who was not always optimistic. He wasn't a pessimist. He was usually, pardon the expression, agnostic between optimism and pessimism. Meaning, he's usually indeterminate. You're usually left hanging at the end, except for the works that are tragedies, and the tragic genre is something that he really did, work very well in. But the works that are not explicit tragedies, where the characters end, in a cemetery, dead at the end, or in a leper colony, the works are often left indeterminate. We don't know what happens to Blumenacht at the end of Sipur. We don't know what happens to Blumenacht at the end of Sipur Pashut. That's the right, and the not the alternative ending. The ending of Shira, the ending that he chose, was we don't know what happened to Shira, and he says Shira lo erecha. I won't show you Shira. What happened to her? I won't tell you. It's left up in the air with his puzzle, with this riddle. That was the method that he chooses. Here there is an optimistic ending despite the pessimism, but it is a description of the destruction, the utter destruction, physical, spiritual, material, emotional, economic, that took place after World War I. And we overlook that. Because the tragedy of the destruction of World War I, 20 years later, is grossly overshadowed, like a candle in the daylight, by what happens in World War II. But in that interwar period, World War I was this calamitous experience on all levels, and in the Jewish community, no less so. And it's this description he gets there, and I don't want to ruin the plot, but I want to explore one motif. I have some quotes here in the Hebrew, but it's getting late. I'm not going to read the whole thing. The narrator comes and he sees this old hometown. It's, the population has been decimated, and the kind of way that tradition was the whoop and wharf of Jewish life has been eroded. Even the old Beit Midrash is shuttered and closed. He says, how could this be? How could it be that the old Beit Midrash is shuttered and closed? This old Beit Midrash where the author himself had spent his boyhood. So the town elders say, look, if you're interested, here's the key. Open it up. So he opens it up. He buys wood, stokes the fire, heats up the place, puts out a little coffee and rugelach, whatever it is, and that's why they come. But they come back to learn, and he gets a minyan going, and there's this revival of Jewish life. But he knows in his heart that they're coming because they can't afford to heat their own homes. And here in the Beis Medrash, at least in the winter, it's warm. At a certain point, the key goes missing. He gets to shul one morning, goes to take out the key. It's not a little key like we have. It was, like a proper, you have some pictures there on the sheets, a right proper big metal key. It's missing. Along comes Daniel Bach. You have it here on the sheet. Daniel Bach is the kind of like town, where's my sheet? Oh, here. He's kind of like the town, I wouldn't call him the town apikoris, but he's somebody who's left the life of traditional observance. He's missing a leg. He'd lost a leg. And the description of all the people in the town, of the maimed and deformed people who in World War I, this one's missing an arm, this one's missing a leg, this one's missing, as a character, is missing a nose. He's got this hole in the middle of his face, and it of course affects his speech. He speaks in this kind of like whistle because he doesn't have a nose. And this is what it was like. Now, they didn't have plastic surgery, and they didn't have prostheses and things the way that we have today. And this was a description of people that came home from war, and it's of course a metaphor for the destruction that's taking place both in the physical world but in the spiritual world as well. You have it here. It's on this page at the bottom of the column. That's from pages 77 and 78. Yom echad matzati Daniel Bach. You see how he spells Bach? Bet Chipchak Chet. Shachar raglo shel etz ve'amar yaseh mar kederech shasiti ani. So Bach says to him, well, you're missing your key. You should do what I did. I used to have a leg. Now I have a replacement leg. I've got a peg leg. You used to have a key. Make a copy. So they call the locksmith. The locksmith comes, breaks open the door, makes him a new key. The next paragraph in the center. Hamasger kiyem et haftachato v'asali mafteach. The locksmith makes him a new key. Natalti et hamafteach v'amarti et mol haita gush barzel. Yesterday you were but a lump of metal. Natan b'cha ha'oman eina v'asucha kli chafetz. The artisan, the locksmith, put his mind to you and transformed you from a lump of metal into a precious object, to a useful tool. Kiyotze b'zeh amarti latzmi. So I said to myself, et mol hayita gush basar. Yesterday you were just a hunk of flesh. Niftach lefanecha Beit Midrash v'naseta Adam. But you go into the Beit Midrash. The Beit Midrash can transform a hunk of flesh into a human being. טמנתי את המפתח בכיסי ואמרתי מכאן ואילך אני משמר אותך כדי שתשמור עליי. I was carefully guarded the key in my pocket. I'll guard the key will guard me. The end of his trip, he goes back to Yerushalayim. He left his wife and 2 kids in Talpiot, very much like the author who wrote the story. He gets back to his home in Yerushalayim. His wife's unpacking his suitcase. And in a crevice in the suitcase, between the lining of the suitcase, the key, the original key, was found. It had slipped in a hole in the lining of the suitcase, and he had it with him all the time. You know, like Dorothy, who's, she's got the power to go back home, just all she has to do is click her heels together. It was with him the whole time. So she says, what are you going to do with it? You should send it back to Buchach? She says, why should I send it back to Buchach? They have the replacement key, which they don't use, because after he left, the whole operation went bust. So they need 2 keys to the base measures they're not going to use? I will save it here. And then he makes reference to, in that way that Agnon, of course, always weaves together the Midrash and Chazal and the Agadot, to the rather well-known Gemara in Megillah, you have at the bottom of the first page, that describes how in the days of Mashiach, the Batei Midrashot, the Batei Knesiot Shebebavel, all of the synagogues and study houses in Chutz La'aretz, in the diaspora, that they too will miraculously be transported to Yerushalayim. So I don't have to send it back to the Beis Medrash in Buchach, because soon enough the Beis Medrash in Buchach will come to me. And then you have here on page 440, עמדתי וצפנתי את המפתח בתיבה ותליתי את המפתח התיבה על ליבי. I placed this heavy metal key in a safe box, locked it up, and then the key to the safe box, the key to the key, I wore on a chain around my neck. ולמה לא תליתי את של בית מדרשנו הישן על ליבי? So why didn't I just wear the actual key around my neck? מפני שאין הלב יכול להחזיקו מחמת כבדו. It was too heavy. שהאומנים הראשונים היו עושים מפתחותיהם גדולים וכבדים ואינם לפי שיעור ליבנו. It's too big. המפתח צפון במקום שצפנתיו ואני חזרתי לעבודתי. So the key is locked away, I go back to my work. כשהייתי נזכר בו הייתי מחשב בליבי עתידים בתי הכנסיות ובתי מדרשות וכולי וכולי. Whenever I think about it, I recall that Gemara that the synagogues of the world are destined to come to Yerushalayim. ואני פותח את חלוני וצופה לחוץ שמא הם מתגלגלים ובאים לקבוע עצמם בארץ ישראל. I open the window, I look out, trying to peek to see if I can get a glimpse of them. Maybe they're on their way, those synagogues and study halls. אוי, האדמה שוממה ושותקת, ואין כל פסיעיהם של בתי כנסת ובתי מדרשות נשמע. The land is desolate, but the footsteps of redemption, the footsteps of those Batei Knesset, those synagogues, they're not heard, they're not on their way. ועדיין המפתח מונח ומצפה עמי לאותו היום. ברם הוא שעשוי ברזל ונחושת יכול לעמוד כך. The key and I are sitting and waiting. The key is made of brass. It can last a long time. אני, שאני בשר ודם, קשה לי לעמוד בי. But I'm just flesh and blood. It's harder for me to wait. That's the end of the novel. I haven't, it seems like I've given it all away. I haven't.
Yeah.
Then there's a coda to the novel. There's a character who we met earlier named Reb Shlomo Bach. He's the father of this Daniel Bach. And unlike Daniel, Shlomo Bach is a representative of the old world of faith and tradition. He's the chazan in the shul. The night that the narrator arrives, it's Yom Kippur, he hears Reb Shlomo Bach davening Kol Nidre. Reb Shlomo Bach had another son, Yerucham, who had gone off on Aliyah, lived at Ramat Rachel, the kibbutz, which is right next to Agnon's house, and was killed in the Arab uprisings in the 20s. Old Reb Shlomo Bach is getting on in years, and the Chavrei Kibbutz invite him to come and live with them, live out his remaining days on the kibbutz where his son is buried. And he goes off on Aliyah, Reb Shlomo Bach. And he's really the only character who really is able to maintain his connection to tradition and his connection to the land. And, very often these were dichotomous things. And at that certain point in his life, I told you, Agnon himself made that choice, that when you come on Aliyah, you leave your kippah behind. And it was only in midlife that he returned to it. And Reb Shlomo Bach goes off, but he's an old man on the kibbutz. What is he going to do? He's going to be a kibbutznik. So he goes off to the garden and he sees they're plowing and hoeing and etc. He says, all of those Mishnayot and all those Gemarot about the sanctity of the land of Israel and the laws pertaining to the produce, the mitzvah atliot ba'aretz, truma, maaser, etc. It was always just this kind of theoretical thing. But now I see it's practical. You're aware that there's such halachot. Shemitah is coming up this year. And there's this beautiful passage where he describes what Torat Eretz Yisrael is. And it's a page that is almost lifted directly out of Rav Kook. About Torat Eretz Yisrael, that in Israel we can implement the Torah. That not just that there are mitzvot that you can do in Israel that you can't do in Manhattan, but that the design of creation is that the Torah is meant to be kept in the land of Israel. It is Agnon's most explicitly Zionistic work. And this Reb Shlomo Bach, the narrator goes off to see him, to visit him, and he encounters him and he tells him this story. The name Bach, what is it? Bayit Chadash. What's it?
I'm a descendant, that's how I know.
Of the Bach.
Yeah.
Right, so the Bach, Rav Yoel Sirkis, wrote this important commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, the Bayit Chadash, which is abbreviated Bet Chet. There is such a last name, Bach. If you look in the Jerusalem phone book, for example, you'll see that there's, a column and a half of people Bach, but not spelled in this way. It's spelled Bet, Aleph, Kaf Sofit, or Bet, Kaf Sofit. This is very strange. Like the composer, Bach. Right? It's a very. I have no doubt that Agnon chooses the name Bach so that you should have this echo of Bayit Chadash. What's the Bayit? Not to refer to your great-great-grandfather, whoever wrote the Bayit Chadash, but that what's the Bayit Chadash? Is Eretz Yisrael. That Reb Shlomo, also a very evocative name, Shalem, the only character in the book who's not somehow broken spiritually or mentally or physically or in one way or another, right? That can only be in the Bayit Chadash. And that world that Agnon is memorializing in all of the works. Shlomo is also God's name. That the world that's lost, that Agnon is memorializing in all of his works, is transplanted to the land of Israel. In the Nobel Prize speech in 1966, it's written here on the money. We're changing the money in Israel, I think, later this year. So if you want your commemorative 50 shekel note with Agnon's picture on it, you better get it now. But on the 50 shekel note, in these teeny tiny little letters, is a quote from the Nobel Prize speech. Agnon goes to Stockholm, wearing that big black yarmulke and that tuxedo, and he gets up and he makes this speech. The fashion was that, not every Nobel laureate makes a speech. It's the prize, the Peace Prize has a separate ceremony, and then for all the arts and sciences, it's the literature person that makes the speech, which I guess you can understand he might pull it off better than the physicist. And Agnon makes a speech. Agnon could not speak English. at least not well, and he certainly couldn't speak Swedish. So the minog is that if you speak a different language, you say like the opening paragraph in your native language, and then the whole thing is read on your behalf in English. But there's a recording of it. If you go onto the Nobel Prize speech, you can even see a video. If you go onto the Nobel Prize website, you can even see a video of it. But Agnon gets up there, and he says the following, and this is the famous quote, in his thickly accented Yiddishy Hebrew, which makes you feel good, because no matter how bad your Hebrew accent is, here's the master of the Hebrew language, the guy who practically invents modern Hebrew, and he's got a thicker accent than you do. Mitoch katastrofa historit, shechriv Titus melech Romi et Yerushalayim, v'gala Yisrael me'atzo, noladati ani ba'achat me'orei hagolah. Because of the historic catastrophe that Titus of Rome destroyed Jerusalem and banished the Jewish people, I was born in one of the cities of the diaspora. Aval b'chol eit tamid domeh hayiti alai kemi shenolad b'Yerushalayim. But I always imagined myself as if I'd been born in Jerusalem. And then he reminds the king of Sweden and the assembled crowd that he's a Levi. One wonders what the king of Sweden knew about, the king of Sweden says, so on Mondays and Thursdays, if there's no Kohen, do you get the first Aliyah? So he remind him as a Levi. And the task of the Leviim in the Beit HaMikdash was to sing the sweet songs of David Melech Yisrael, songs so sweet that no ear has ever heard. And because that job was taken away from him, he was compensated to sing in prose what we formerly sang in praise. And he describes the role of the modern Hebrew author as a continuation of David HaMelech and Tehillim. And he describes the work of the modern Hebrew author. He describes the work of writing modern Hebrew literature, as a form of avodat Hashem, of divine service. And he also describes it as a nechama, a consolation for the great historic tragedy that has befallen the Jewish people. Yes, starting with Churban HaBayit, but you don't need to be a great literary critic to understand that he's using that mashal to describe other calamities that had only very recently befallen the Jewish people, namely the Shoah. That the task of modern Hebrew literature was to serve as a replacement for a world that was and no longer is. Ma nishtairu sipurei hamasiot. The stories are all that we have. But not just as a form of imaginative history, of imaginative memory. Gershom Shalom in this very important Shalom has these two important essays about his friend Agnon. I think one was written after he got the prize, and one may have been written after he died. They're both in English. They're both in Gershom Shalom has his volume on Jews and Judaism in Crisis. If you're interested, I can also email you these. Just email me. I'll send them to you. Shalom says that Agnon was this great transitional figure. He stood on the crossroads. On the crossroads of that great historic breach that separated the world of old with the world of now, the world imbued with faith and tradition to a world of much greater question, the world of Europe, the world of the land of Israel. And Agnon stands at the crossroads, and he says to those of us standing on this side of the breach, Yidden, since you no longer can accept the weight of that which was, I will distill it for you through my stories so that you can still take it with you. And he's this kind of Janus figure that can look both forward and backward, because there was a necessity, there was a need for that world to still have impact in our world. The question, which we were talking about before we began, about the degree to which Agnon can still be appreciated for that. Well, like all the classics, every year more is whittled away from the curriculum. Every year, well, why would anybody read a book when you can watch cats playing with string on YouTube or who knows what? It's not everybody in Manhattan came here tonight to hear about Hebrew literature. This is not the entire population of the island. And we who do have this appreciation, we who do understand that it's good for the soul, it's important. It's important that we digest it. For us, for him, for the Jewish people, there's value. There's certain things that can only be communicated in the imaginative way, and that's an important thing. So everybody should now read Oreach Notal Alum. I'm happy to entertain any questions. Meaning toys. Yeah. There's some debate about what the etymology of that name Tchotchkes is, but Agnon once said in some Kabbalistic text there's a name of one of the malachim, one of the angels, is something that's somewhat similar, and he said, "Oh, that's it. That's our name." But he was just being inventive when he said that. But there's some debate about what the etymology of the name is. But it's true that Tchotchkes is. I actually suggested at the Beit Agnon they had this. It's hard to call it a gift shop, but they sell these. They sell the books and they sell some other things. I said they should call the name of the shop Tchotchkes.
That's a great idea.
That's a good idea.
Right.
Was he a collector of incunabula or old svarim?
He was a collector of old svarim, not so much in Kunabula because those are quite expensive and rare. But he had this. Not only did he have a very large library, he had 3 large libraries. The first 2 were destroyed. The first was destroyed in 1924 in this fire in Germany. Then he rebuilt his library, and in 1929, the house he was living in, not the house that's today Beit Agnon, but the house he was living in at the time in Talpiot, was marauded during the Arab riots, and much of the library was again destroyed. And now there's the library that, if you go to Beit Agnon, you can see it. He had a very, very, very impressive library.
I had the impression that he did collect.
He was a bibliophile.
That he collected.
Yeah, and there's some books there that are quite old, and some of them presumably are quite valuable. But he had this very, very large library, and that was part of the work that he did for Shokin. Besides having to write stories, Shokin himself was a bibliophile, and his library, the Shokin Library, was then later donated to the Jewish Theological Seminary.
My grandfather, Rabbi David Frankel, was a specialist in incunabula and Kisveyada, and it seems to me that I had once heard that he had an interest in
So, but I don't know that he had too many of them in his personal collection, but he had this long-standing, lifelong interest in books, and actually one of his books, a number of his books are non-fiction. There are these anthologies like Yamim Noraim, The Days of Awe, which is his best-selling work, actually, this anthology of sources on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. That he didn't compose, he anthologized it, he collected.
Like the editor.
Right. He's got another work called Sefer Sofer V'Sipur, which is a collection of Maisalach, stories about Jewish books from the Bible up to the modern period. It's got some very many wonderful anecdotes and things in there. He was a great lover of books. But Shokin, who was also a great lover of books, part of Agnon's task was he was like the book buyer. He was like he would, if something would become available, and presumably here there were incunabula and other manuscripts and other valuable things, he would buy them for the Shokin collection, but he did that with Shokin's credit card or whatever it was, however it worked. Shabbat Shalom.